Welcome to the Hooga Hooga Swamp, and I'm Skold Kona, a convict criminologist. For several years, I've studied how crime is understood beyond the courtroom, how narratives form, how meaning is made, how copycat phenomena emerge, and how digital communities shape public perception of crime. My work has been guided by criminologists at University of Washington, Tacoma and Seattle University, whose research examines these very questions. This case study isn't about convincing you that Mackenzie Sharilla is guilty or innocent. It's about examining what happened after the crash. It's about how a criminal case evolved into an online narrative, how competing stories took on lives of their own, and what that reveals about crime, culture, and the meaning making in the digital age. I wrestled with this case for a long time. I didn't start in either camp. I wasn't convinced Mackenzie Sharilla was innocent, and I wasn't convinced she was the monster social media made her out to be. My honest starting point was simply, I don't know. Part of the reason I struggled is because it was difficult for me to wrap my head around the idea that a 17-year-old could intentionally use a car as a weapon against people she supposedly cared about. So, like every case I study, I started with a presumption of innocence and let the evidence, not my emotions or the internet, guide me. As I worked through the case, I realized my initial assumptions weren't nearly as important as the totality of the evidence. No single piece convinced me. It was the cumulative weight of the text messages, witness testimony, driving behavior, social media evidence admitted at trial, and the surrounding circumstances that ultimately changed my perspective. I also learned an important legal distinction. I spent a long time wrestling with the idea of premeditation, only to realize that under Ohio law, that wasn't the central issue. The question wasn't whether the prosecution proved premeditation, it was whether it proved purposeful intent. Understanding that distinction completely changed the way I viewed the case. Whether someone ultimately agrees with the verdict or not, this case reminded me why we don't evaluate evidence one fact at a time. We evaluate the totality of the circumstances. More importantly, it reminded me that the goal of studying criminal justice isn't to defend our first opinion, it's to follow the evidence wherever it leads. At the end of this video, I'm going to tell you where I ultimately landed on the Mackenzie Sharilla case. But this isn't a video about convincing you she's guilty or innocent. It's about the process of navigating social media contagion, competing narratives, and meaning making. I want to show you how I worked through the noise, questioned my own assumptions, and arrived at a conclusion I feel comfortable defending. Whether you agree with me or not, my goal is to show you the process, not just the verdict. This isn't really a case study about Mackenzie Sharilla. It's a case study about how we arrive at our beliefs in the age of social media. Many people online have labeled Mackenzie Sharilla a psychopath or a monster. Those are conclusions I cannot support. The PCLR is a clinical forensic instrument administered by trained professionals, and there is insufficient information in the public record for me to make that assessment. My focus is on the evidence presented in the case, not on assigning psychiatric labels. So we walk through, before we talk about theories, social media, YouTube, guilt or innocence, we have to begin where every version of this story begins. Two young men lost their lives, two families lost their sons. So, whatever conclusions people reach about this case, that reality never changes. Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan were not content, they were not entertainment, they were not hashtags, they were not algorithms, they were human beings. Every conversation that follows owes them that respect. But after the tragedy, the conversation rarely stayed centered on people who were lost. Almost immediately, the focus begins to shift. The questions become who's lying, who's telling the truth, who's the victim, who's the villain, who deserves our sympathy, or who deserves our anger. And before long, people aren't simply evaluating evidence anymore. They're constructing narratives, they're choosing sides, they're defending identities. On the morning of July 31st, 2022, in Strongsville, Ohio, three young people left a friend's house after spending the night together. Behind the wheel was Mackenzie Sharilla, then 17 years old. Riding with her were her boyfriend, Dominic Russo, age 20, and their friend, Davion Flanagan, age 19. They'd spent the evening socializing before leaving around 5:30 a.m. Just minutes later, Mackenzie drove her Toyota Camry into an industrial park. Surveillance footage in the vehicle's event data recorder showed the car accelerating to approximately 100 miles an hour before striking a brick commercial building. Investigators found no evidence that the brakes were applied before impact. Dominic and Davion died at the scene. Mackenzie survived with serious injuries. What initially appeared to be a tragic traffic collision quickly became a homicide investigation. Prosecutors argued that the crash was intentional, citing the vehicle's data, surveillance video, prior relationship conflict, and other circumstantial evidence. McKinsey maintained that she had no memory of the crash and denied intentionally causing it. Following a bench trial, she was convicted of multiple offenses, including murder, and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The conviction has since been upheld on appeal. Today, the case has evolved into something much larger than a criminal trial. It's become a focal point where debates about intent versus impulsivity, adolescent brain development, digital influence, parasocial communities, and how online audiences construct narratives long after a courtroom reaches a verdict. But this case study isn't about deciding guilt or innocent. The courts have already spoken. What interests us is something different. What happened after the verdict? How did YouTube creators, TikTok, Reddit, and thousands of strangers begin constructing competing realities around the same set of facts? That's where criminology becomes fascinating. As time passed, public conversation increasingly centered on one name, Mackenzie Sharilla. To some, she represents intentional violence. To others, she represents adolescent impulsivity. To still others, she represents concerns about criminal justice itself. Three radically different stories, one event. This is a criminological case study. It's not an attempt to relitigate the case. Chapter 1, The Edge in Everyone. So, up to this point, we've been examining stories, but beneath every story lies a human being, and beneath every criminal case lies a question that criminologists, psychologists, and neuroscientists have been asking for decades. What separates an ordinary day from the worst decision someone will ever make? We often imagine violence as something committed by people who are fundamentally different from us, but the evidence suggests something much more uncomfortable. Most people are capable of remarkable compassion and remarkable harm, depending on the interaction between person and the situation. This is why I call this chapter The Edge in Everyone. The title isn't meant to be frightening, it's meant to be honest. Every one of us lives on an edge. Most days we never notice it because most days our psychological brakes are working. We sleep, we eat, we have people who interrupt us, we have routines, we have hope, and we have tomorrow. Those things keep us further away from the edge than we realize. The deeper truth, here's the lesson I hope everybody remember. Prevention is not about finding dangerous people. Prevention is about protecting ordinary people before ordinary circumstances overwhelm them. None of us are one step from violence, but all of us have thresholds. Those thresholds rise or fall depending on the systems surrounding us. This framework is not a model of criminality. it's a model of human behavior. It doesn't explain one crime, it explains why behavior emerges through systems. No single factor creates violence. Human behavior emerges from interactions, internal states, social environment, stress, opportunity, meaning, relationship, time. Remove enough safeguards, and nearly everyone begins thinking differently. The brake system. We often ask, why didn't they stop? That's actually the wrong question. The better question is what normally allows people to stop. We all possess psychological brakes: time, sleep, emotional regulation, distance, perspective, values, healthy relationships. These aren't conveniences, they're safety systems. Losing the brakes. The brakes rarely disappear all at once. They erode. Stress accumulates, conflict increases, sleep disappears, isolation grows. Alcohol and drugs may be a factor. Humiliation, fear, panic. None of these automatically create violence, but together they reduce the distance between impulse and action. The bridge failure. This deserves some serious consideration. Every bridge has load limits. So does every human nervous system. Under overwhelming stress, attention narrows, time changes, future thinking shrinks, options disappear. The person often experiences a powerful illusion. There is only one way. But that feeling is not reality. It is state dependent thinking. The bridge hasn't disappeared, the person's ability to see alternatives have. So then we move into cognitive narrowing. As arousal increases, cognition decreases. People don't become smarter under stress, they become simpler. Flexible thinking becomes rigid. Reflection disappears. Long term consequences become invisible. Immediate emotion dominates. This isn't unique to offenders. Every human being experiences cognitive narrowing. The only difference is what happens next. So, the protective scaffolding. Fortunately, escalation isn't the only thing that stacks. Protection stack too. Friends, family, accountability, behaviors, rest, therapy, mentors, emotional regulation, communities. These don't make people perfect. They increase the number of opportunities for pause to return. So this is critical. So why spend so much time discussing this? Because this case study was never intended to diagnose Mackenzie Sharilla, nor to excuse her, nor to condemn her. It's an invitation to think differently about human behavior. Criminal cases often tempt us to ask what kind of person would do that. Criminology encourages a different question: what combination of individual, relational, environmental, and situational forces allowed this behavior to emerge? That question doesn't replace accountability. It makes prevention possible, and prevention is where our attention belongs if our goal is fewer tragedies rather than simply more verdicts. So, how can thousands of intelligent people watch the same trial, review the same evidence, listen to the same testimony, and leave believing completely different things? Because perhaps the most fascinating part of this story isn't the crash. Perhaps it's what happened afterwards. So every storm has a center. So for this story, that center is surprisingly simple: a vehicle, three young people, a roadway, a collision, two deaths, a criminal investigation, a trial, a conviction. Those facts form the foundation upon which everything else is built. And yet, facts rarely organize themselves. Human beings organize them. We connect the dots. We assign motives. We search for meaning because the human brain dislikes unfinished stories. Psychologists call this meaning making. Criminologists have been studying it for decades. When information is incomplete, we instinctively begin to fill in gaps, sometimes accurately, sometimes not. One of the first lessons students learn in criminology is that there is a difference between an event and the story constructed around that event. The event happens once. The story can be told 1,000 different ways, and every retelling emphasizes different details, different emotions, different assumptions, and different conclusions. That distinction matters because a courtroom has one responsibility to determine legal responsibility. Society has a very different habit. Society constructs meaning. Those are not the same process. One produces a verdict, the other produces culture, and culture often outlives the verdict. Today, after the trial, millions of people know this case, not because they read every page of discovery, not because they attended every day of the testimony, not because they interviewed witnesses, but because they encountered a story. And stories have extraordinary power, not because they change the facts, but because they change how the facts are experienced. That brings us to the first major question. If facts remain constant, why do the stories become so different? So we've examined the tragedy, we've introduced the question, now we begin to examine how the question is answered. Because once a crime enters the public sphere, it doesn't remain a single story. It becomes many stories, not because the evidence changes, but because different systems are trying to answer different questions. The police ask one set of questions, the courtroom asks another, journalists and content creators ask still other questions. Families search for meaning, communities debate accountability, viewers try to reconcile emotion with evidence. Each group begins with many of the same facts, yet they often arrive at very different conclusions. This isn't necessarily because one group is dishonest or another is correct. It's because each system has its own purpose, its own rules, and its own way of constructing meaning. Criminology reminds us that crime is never interpreted in a vacuum. It is filtered through institutions, through media, and through the lived experience of the people trying to understand it. For this case study, we examined three distinct meaning making systems, not to determine which one is right, but to understand how each of these shape the story we tell, that we tell, and the ones that we ultimately believe. So we've got narrative one, institutional meaning; narrative two, media meaning; and narrative three, personal meaning. And this is meaning making. As soon as we move through these meaning making systems, we keep one question in mind. If the facts remain constant, why did the stories become so different? That question is at the heart of this case study because this isn't simply an examination of one criminal case. It's an examination of how institutions and media and people construct reality itself. At first glance, these three systems appear to be talking about the same case. They share many of the same photographs, the same surveillance footage, testimony, crash, same courtroom, and yet they often tell remarkably different stories, not because they possess different realities, but because they ask different questions. Each system has a different purpose, a different audience, a different standard for what matters. To understand how one event can produce so many competing narratives, we first have to understand how each system constructs meanings. So let's begin where law begins. So, narrative one, institutional meaning. The institutional narrative is built through process. Police officers who collect evidence, investigators reconstruct events, forensic experts analyze physical findings, prosecutors present a theory of the case, defense attorneys challenge that theory, judges interpret the law, the rules of evidence determine what may or may not be considered. This system is deliberately structured. It does not ask whether everyone agrees. It does not ask whether a verdict will be popular. It asks a narrower question: has the legal burden of proof been satisfied? The courtroom is not designed to answer every moral, philosophical, or psychological question surrounding a tragedy. Its purpose is to answer legal questions according to established procedures. That distinction matters because a legal verdict is not the end of public conversation. In many ways, it's the beginning. The moment the trial ends, another system begins speaking. Media media narrative. Outside the courtroom doors, the evidence doesn't disappear, it travels into newsrooms, live streams, podcasts, YouTube channels, TikTok feeds, Reddit threads, and millions of conversations between people who were never present in the courtroom. The institutional narrative reaches a conclusion. The media narrative begins asking new questions. The moment a trial ends, another trial begins, not in the courtroom, but online. The evidence leaves the courthouse and enters an entirely different world, a world without rules of evidence, without objections, without judicial instructions, without one person responsible for deciding what is relevant. Instead, the evidence begins to travel across newsrooms, through podcasts, across YouTube, and into live stream chats, into millions of conversations among people who were never present for a single day of testimony. Unlike the institutional narrative, the media narrative is not trying to reach a legal verdict. It is trying to answer different questions. What does this evidence mean? What might investigators have missed? Was justice served? What can this case teach us? Different creators answer those questions in different ways. Some approach a case like investigative journalists, others focus on legal analysis, some examine psychology, others concentrate on body language, digital evidence, or courtroom strategy. Some are educators, some are commentators, some are storytellers, some are entertainers. Each selects different pieces of the same puzzle, each emphasizes different details, each frames the story through a particular lens. That doesn't necessarily make one right and another wrong. It simply means they're constructing different narratives from the same body of information. For many viewers, these creators become the primary way they experience a criminal case. Long after the courtroom falls silent, the conversation continues, sometimes for months, sometimes for a year. The trial may be over, but the narrative is still evolving. And with every new live stream, every new video, every new comment, the story is told once again. So then we move into narrative three, but neither the courtroom nor the media has the final word because every case eventually reaches its largest audience, us, the viewers, the readers, the listeners, the families, the supporters, the skeptics, the critics. Every person who watches a case study reads a headline, scrolls through a comment section, or joins a live stream because part of the story's next chapter, not by changing the facts, but by assigning meaning. So the personal narrative, she's innocent and she's guilty. Narrative three is the most personal narrative. It doesn't exist inside a courtroom. It doesn't belong to a news organization. It lives inside each of us. Every person brings something different to a case. Our experiences, our values, our fears, our beliefs about justice, our understanding of trauma, our trust or distrust or institutions, our own life stories become lenses through which we interpret someone else's. That is why two thoughtful, intelligent people can watch the same trial and hear the same testimony, review the same evidence, and sincerely reach different conclusions. Not because one is necessarily ignoring the facts, but because meaning is never created by facts alone. It is created through interpretation. In the digital age, the interpretation no longer happens in private, it unfolds publicly in comment sections on Reddit, in YouTube videos, during live screens. One person's interpretation influence in others. Communities form, shared narratives emerge. Agreement becomes identity, disagreement becomes conflict. Before long, people are no longer defending only their interpretation of the evidence, they are defending a community, a creator, or even part of themselves. The story has become bigger than the crime. It's become part of how people understand justice, accountability, truth, and one another. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all, that the event happened once, but meaning is still constructed millions of times. So, how we construct reality. The human brain was built to make meaning. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures. We don't simply observe the world, we organize it. We connect events, we infer motives, we build stories. Long before criminologists studied crime, psychologists were studying something even more fundamental, how people transform information into meaning. We don't see reality, we interpret it. Reality isn't something we discover, it is something we construct. Every culture, every family, every profession, every institution develops ways of interpreting the world. Crime is no different. A detective sees evidence, a prosecutor sees proof, a defense attorney sees reasonable doubt, a journalist sees a story, a YouTube creator sees a narrative, a grieving parent sees loss. The event remains the same, the meaning changes. Because meaning is never found, it's created. Sociologists have long argued that reality is built through the stories we tell, the institutions we trust, and the communities we belong to. The brain hates unfinished stories. There's a need for cognitive closure. Humans dislike uncertainty. We rush to answer, especially after tragedy. Pattern recognition is predominant in meaning making. The brain connects the dots, sometimes correctly, sometimes incorrectly. This naturally leads into confirmation bias. The need for cognitive closure. So compare it to an unfinished jigsaw puzzle, one piece missing, and the brain desperately tries to finish it. Once we begin constructing a story, our brains naturally start looking for evidence that support it. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. So we move into framing. It is one of the most common and most misunderstood features of human thinking. Confirmation bias does not mean people are dishonest. It does not mean they are unintelligent. It means that once we adopt an explanation, our attention is naturally drawn towards information that reinforce it. While contradictory information often receive less attention, imagine two people watching the exact same trial. One believes the crash was intentional, the other believes it was a tragic accident. They watch the same testimony, the same surveillance footage, the same expert witnesses, yet each notices different details, not because the evidence changed, but because their minds are organizing that evidence into different stories. The evidence remains constant, the narrative evolves. Confirmation bias explains what we notice. Framing explains what we emphasize. Every storyteller makes choices. Which evidence comes first? Which testimony receives attention? Which facts become headlines? Which details are repeated? Which questions remain unanswered? These decisions create a frame. The frame doesn't necessarily change the facts, it changes the way those facts are experienced. The same event viewed through different frames can fill entirely different stories. Crime is not experienced as a list of facts, it's experienced as a story. Narrative criminology reminds us that stories shape how people understand crime, justice, responsibility, and identity. Crime is not experienced. So, bringing it all together, now the question becomes easier to answer. How can thousands of intelligent people watch the same trial, review the same evidence, and leave believing completely different things? Because meaning is not extracted from evidence. like gold from a mine. It's constructed through pattern recognition, through cognitive closure, through confirmation bias, through framing, through narrative, through facts. But facts do not interpret themselves, people do. And once millions of people begin constructing meaning together, something entirely new emerges, not simply discussion, not simply debate, but a digital culture built around the crime itself. This is where our story goes next. Welcome to the digital Wild West. If chapter 4 explained how the human mind creates meaning, chapter 5 explores where the meaning now lives. For most of human history, stories traveled slowly through families, communities, newspapers, books, television. Information moved from a relatively small number of storytellers to a relatively large audience. Today, that relationship has changed. Everyone can become a storyteller, an investigator, a commentator, a publisher. A single criminal case can generate thousands of videos, millions of comments, countless live streams, and years of ongoing debate. The courtroom may close, the internet never does. This is why I refer to today's online landscape as the digital Wild West. Like the American frontier, it is vast, fast moving, competitive, creative, innovative, but also largely self governed. Authority is decentralized. Information moves rapidly. Reputation can be built overnight or destroyed just as quickly. Ideas compete for attention, narratives compete for belief, and attention has become one of the most valuable forms of currency. Unlike the courtroom, there are no formal rules of evidence. No judge determines relevance, no witness is sworn under oath, no juries receive legal instructions. Instead, credibility isn't negotiated in real time. Sometimes it's through careful research, sometimes through expertise, sometimes through popularity, personality, algorithms, emotion. The digital Wild West does not determine what is true. It determines what people are most likely to encounter. And what people repeatedly encounter often becomes familiar. What becomes familiar often becomes believable. This does not make people irrational, it makes them human because the same psychological processes we discussed in chapter 4, pattern recognition, cognitive closure, confirmation bias, and narrative construction, continue operating inside this new digital environment. Only now they are amplified. Millions of people are participating simultaneously. Each comment influences another, each video inspires another, each live stream generates new conversations, each recommendation creates another pathway through the digital landscape. Meaning is no longer constructed individually, it is constructed collectively. And that collective meaning can become remarkably powerful. Communities form shared identities. Creators develop loyal audiences, viewers become participants, participants become advocates, and advocates become communities. The story grows larger than the crime itself. At that point, the discussion is no longer simply about what happened. It becomes about identity, justice, trust, authority, belonging, and that is where criminology intersects with digital culture. The digital Wild West is not merely a collection of websites, it is a social environment, an ecosystem, one that shapes how we understand crime, how we discuss justice, and sometimes how future behavior itself begins to emerge. Chapter 6, the behavioral emergence model. So, throughout this case study, we've examined the events, we've explored how institutions construct meaning, we've examined how media shapes narrative, we've looked at how individuals interpret information, and we've explored the psychological process that influenced those interpretations. But one important question remains: how does meaning become behavior? Criminology has never suggested that crime has a single cause. Human behavior is rarely the product of one decision, one emotion, or one moment. Instead, behavior emerges from the interaction of many different forces operating at the same time. To help visualize the process, this is a behavior emergence model. This model is not about predicting a specific person's behavior, nor is it about explaining a single criminal case. Instead, it offers a way of thinking about how biological, psychological, social, environmental, and situational factors can interact over time. No single layer explains the behavior, it is their interaction that matters. So, cognitive scripts. Human beings do not invent every response from scratch. We learn, we observe, we imitate. Families teach us, friends influence us, communities shape us. Movies, television, social medias, past experiences, these become cognitive scripts, mental templates for understanding situations and responding to them. Some scripts encourage resilience, others encourage aggression, others normalize behaviors we might never have considered on our own. So, layer three, situational convergent, even powerful emotions and learned behaviors do not automatically become action. Circumstances matter, opportunity matters, environment matters, who is present, who is absent, time, place, access, supervision, support, or lack of it. Criminologists have long recognized that behavior emerges through the interaction between people and situations. Layer four, the behavioral trajectory. Behavior rarely appears without warning. Choices accumulate, patterns develop, small decisions influence larger ones. Some trajectories move towards resilience, others move towards um, escalation. So, intervention can change a trajectory, support can change a trajectory. Accountability can change a trajectory. Nothing is inevitable. Behavior develops over time. So, layer five, the observable outcome. Eventually, behavior becomes visible. A decision is made, an action occurs, a consequence follows. At this point, society begins asking legal questions. Was it intentional? Was it reckless? Was it negligent? Was it preventable? The legal system evaluates the observable outcome, but the outcome is only the final layer. It is not the entire story. Bringing the model together, this model reminds us that behavior does not emerge from a vacuum. It emerges from systems, biology, psychology, relationships, culture, opportunity, environment, digital influence, life experience. None of these factors excuse harmful behavior, nor do they determine destiny, but understanding how they interact gives something more valuable than blame alone. It gives us understanding. And understanding creates opportunities for prevention because if behavior emerges through systems, then prevention can also occur through systems, strengthening families, supporting mental health, teaching emotional regulation, creating healthy communities, encouraging critical thinking, building environments that interrupt harmful trajectories before they become irreversible. Perhaps the most important lesson is this: people do not become offenders in isolation, just as people do not become resilient in isolation. Every life unfolds within a network of relationships, institutions, experiences, and environments. If we truly want to reduce violence, we cannot focus we cannot focus only on the final facts. We must understand the system that allowed the act to emerge. Only then can we begin building systems that encourage different outcomes. Chapter 8: When the Stories Shape Behavior. By now, this story has become much larger than a single criminal case. We've explored how institutions construct meaning, how media constructs meaning, how individuals construct meaning, how the brain organizes information, how digital communities amplify narratives, and how behavior emerges through complex systems rather than simple causes. Now we arrive at perhaps the most important question of all: why does this matter? Because the stories do more than explain the past. Stories shape the future. Every generation learns by observation. Children learn by watching adults, students learn by watching peers, communities learn by watching one another, societies learn through stories. Criminologists have long understood that human behavior is influenced by what people observe, by what they experience, what they admire, what they fear, and what they repeatedly encounter. The hallway becomes a behavioral trajectory. Every doorway represents another decision, another influence, another opportunity, another intervention. Perhaps the greatest lesson isn't simply understanding crime, it is understanding ourselves. Every case becomes a mirror, reflecting not only what happened, but how we think, how we judge, how we empathize, how we assign blame, how we seek certainty, and ultimately who we become, who we choose to become. Crime tells us something about offenders. Our response tells us something about society. Returning to the road. So before we end, I'd like to return to where this case study began, not with theories, not with algorithms, not with cognitive bias, not with social media, not with competing narratives, but with a single moment. On a single roadway, two young men lost their lives, Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan. One young woman lost her freedom, parents lost children, friends lost lifelong companions, entire families were changed forever. It strengthens our ability to recognize risk, to intervene earlier, to ask better questions, to build healthier families, stronger communities, more resilient young people, and institutions capable of preventing harm before tragedy occurs. Crime is rarely the product of a single moment, neither is prevention. Every conversation matters, every relationship matters, every opportunity for guidance matters, every act of compassion matters. If there is one lesson to take from this story, it is that understanding is not the opposite of accountability. It is its foundation, because when we understand how behavior emerges, we become better equipped to interpret it and to prevent it and to create different outcomes for future generations. The facts of this case will never change, but what we choose to learn from it still can. So, after really trying to wrap my head around this tragedy for quite some time now, after really soaking in, I've I'll tell you, if it wasn't for all these content creators, and we're talking about Raw Talk with Pino, YouTube Tube Streets, Crime Circus, U.S. Crime, I Don't Belong Here, Matt Johnson, Ashley Banfield, True Crime Detective, CLR with Bruce Rivers, and AG Tactical, and that's just to name a few of the creators that have helped me to put this together. If it wasn't for them, I wouldn't have been able to come to the conclusions that I've come to. And I thoroughly believe that the courts have it right. And with these, the possibility of parole in 15 years with the amount of infractions that this young woman is racking up at a rapid rate over the few years she's been incarcerated, I think that parole after 15 years is going to be a real hard sell. So I just want to thank you all for joining me on this journey.